It was life-changing for them. Because probably the most impactful comment I heard was one inmate saying, "This is the first time in my life somebody wanted to hear my story." They grew up in an abusive household where their parents didn't care about them. School didn't work for them. That meant that they got into a gang. Now, the gang was obviously wanted them to be a gang member, but their story didn't matter. It was the story of the gang. So it was a unique experience for them to be able to tell something from their own heart rather than try to conform to other people's ideas of what their story should be.
Welcome to Première, Personne, a podcast about vulnerable storytelling where we unpack the transformative power of first-person narratives. I am your host, Brune. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I met today's guest last summer in Lisbon. I was only there for a few weeks, but that evening at a cool cafe in the center of the city, I facilitated a masterclass on how to tell tough stories on stage. At the end, I had the pleasure of chatting with a few of the attendees, including Mark Lovett. There was an air of wisdom about him. He told me that at one point, he co-organized TEDx events inside prison. I knew I had to chat with him again to ask him all about that. I have since discovered that Mark has had years of experience in corporate settings, but also as an organizer of TEDx events. And today he has his own company called Storytelling with Impact, where he is a speaker coach and a facilitator of storytelling workshops. We had a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy. Here's Mark Lovett. Before we dive in, I wanted to let you know that from September 3rd to October 29th of 2023, I am running a writing and self-publishing program. Self-publishing is all about not waiting for someone else to give you permission to be yourself and to share the art, knowledge, wisdom that you have been hoarding inside of you. I think it's high time you shared all of that with the world. I will be with you every week with live coaching calls, and you'll get that sweet accountability so you actually show up and write the damn thing. I am so excited for that program. At the end of the program, we'll have a big book release party where we will all celebrate the fact that we will be published authors. If that piques your interest, go to my website right now. It's experiencenarrative.com, experiencenarrative.com. There is an early bird price, so you might want to go ahead and check that out sooner than later. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Hi, Mark. I'm so happy you're here with me today. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. It's such a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thanks. So, first question, can you say Première Personne and then say what those two words bring up for you?
Première Personne? Is that first person?
Yes.
Well, it invokes this feeling of personal story. You know, stories that are told in the first person that come from your own experiences, your own knowledge, your own wisdom, your own thoughts.
Great. So can you paint us a picture of where you are?
Well, in the grander scheme of things, I am in Lisbon, Portugal. I am in a neighborhood called Campo de Rique, which is a very small enclave on the edge of Lisbon. You know, the main downtown, it's a little bit removed. So it's a very cool neighborhood with a lot of nice people and a couple of parks. And I really love that.
How long have you been in Lisbon?
I've been in Lisbon just over a year. But the prior 2 years, I was across the river from Lisbon. I was still in Portugal, but just a little further away.
Oh, really? How long have you been in Portugal then?
Just over 3 years.
What made you choose Portugal? Or why did Portugal choose you?
That's more to the point. Portugal chose me. For many years, I had wanted to move from the United States to Europe, and I didn't know where. I had always enjoyed every trip I made to Europe, whether that was London or Paris or Milan, various places. And I thought, I'll probably end up in Spain or France, one of those places. But a friend of mine moved to Portugal. And she said, you have to come over here. You have to check it out. It's really cool. The airport will get you to anywhere else in Europe in a couple of hours. So I made a visit, and I just had this feeling that this is where I was supposed to be. I had been running events, which I'm sure we'll talk about, running TEDx events in San Diego. And I finished my last event, and I gave away all my possessions and packed 2 suitcases and got a one-way ticket to Lisbon. So that's how I got here.
I can relate to that. It's a feeling, isn't it? It's just a knowing at some point.
Yes, you know that this is the next chapter of your story.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like it's a great place to be writing more narratives about who you are and what you want to do.
Great. Okay. So we're going to get to know you a little bit more. I heard recently someone say that who you are is what you love. And so I have a list of 10 rapid fire questions for you. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. First question, a song or a music artist you love?
Carlos Santana.
You and I are both fans of Jessica Abel. Can you tell our listeners who she is and why you love her?
Well, professionally, she's more of an illustrator, but I fell in love with her when she wrote a book about storytelling, where she interviewed a lot of people who were doing podcasts, and she put this together into both her own podcast, but also into a book. It was a great collection of insights from a variety of people who were experts in the industry. And so I thought that was very cool. And she throws her own spin on top of that. So she's brilliant.
The book is called Out on the Wire, isn't it? Is that the one? Yeah.
That's it. It's great.
The name of a friend who keeps you honest.
Jacques.
Your favorite food in Lisbon.
The fresh fish.
Your favorite place in nature anywhere in the world.
Bryce Canyon in Utah.
Your top 3 books on writing or telling great stories.
One is, trying to remember if it's just called TED Talks. It's by Chris Anderson, who's the director of TED. And he's brilliant in how he's curated that event. And he's got a lot of tips if that's your style of storytelling for TED Talks. And the other, The Moth has put out a couple of different books over the years. They have a new one on how to tell a story, but they have a couple of previous ones, which are collections of stories that have been told on their stages. And so I love that because it's a reference that you can go back to and see how other people constructed their first person story.
Wonderful. Is there one TED or TEDx talk that spoke to your heart? I'm sure there's more than one, but what's the one that comes up?
Oh, the one that comes up, and I'm trying to remember her name right now. It's she talked about the bail system in prison. And anybody can Google bail system prison and TED Talks, and you're going to find this talk of hers. It resonated with me because I had done 2 TEDx events inside prison. And I heard the stories from the inmates of their life and how they ended up where they were. And her talk was about how the bail system is unfair to people who don't have the resources to actually post bail. So sometimes people are entering a guilty plea when they actually did not commit the crime, because otherwise they would have to stay in jail till their trial. So absolutely brilliant talk.
Thank you. Your favorite news outlet?
I split my time between CNN, BBC, and The Guardian.
Your top 3 podcasts that are focused on personal storytelling?
Well, The Moth would definitely be one of those. There's so many episodes that come out, it's hard to keep up with it. There's a very unique podcast called The Memory Palace. The host is a gentleman named Nate DeMeo. And this is a bit of a segue because it's not his personal stories. He tells stories about other people. So somebody who did something significant in history, which you could easily write a 300 or 400 page book about, he'll do a 10-minute podcast about some unique thread in their story. So for people who want to understand how to condense their own life into a short story, I recommend that because it's brilliant the way he does it. And it's just him narrating these stories.
Fantastic. I've never heard of it. I'll give it a listen. Was there a third one?
Just because prison's on my mind, it's a podcast conducted inside of San Quentin Prison. Ear Hustle is the name of it.
Yes.
And Nigel Poor started this, and a gentleman named Earlonne Woods was inside prison. And after a couple of seasons, he got out of prison. And now he co-hosts with her. And they're absolutely brilliant. They pick different topics each week. So you get to hear these personal stories of people who their life has not turned out the way they planned, but yet it still exposes their absolute humanity. They want the same things in life. They want happiness. They want relationships. It's a very unique perspective. So even people who think, well, prison stories wouldn't apply to me, I recommend that people listen to the episodes because you'll hear a very different kind of storytelling.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for reminding me of Ear Hustle. I listened to it a couple years ago and I had forgotten about it, but I so enjoyed the experience of listening to it and I will definitely go back to it. And so finally, 10th question, big or small, what's one good thing that happened to you in the last 24 hours?
In the last 24 hours, living in Lisbon, every day is a good day here. And yesterday I was just out walking through one of the local parks. It's been raining lately. And so in between the rainstorms, I love walking through this park near my house because you know how it is when it rains and there's all kinds of vegetation. You get this magical smell in the air and it feels like you're on another planet just for these moments. The clouds are still overhead. There's not many people in the park because everything's wet, but the sensations are beautiful.
Thanks for that picture. You brought us there. So you attended a TEDx event in San Diego in 2010 that really, it seems, put you on a path where you then attended many other TEDx events and got to hear hundreds and hundreds of people take the stage and bring their wisdom to an audience of strangers. And of course, today you are coaching many people for that kind of stage and other stages as well. What was it about that first TEDx experience that drew you in? If you can take us to that room with you.
So before that event, I had been watching TED Talks online, watching the videos. And I've always loved TED Talks. They're kind of magical, people bringing all of these different ideas to the stage. And it's based around their personal experience, but they're really focused more on the idea that they want to share. And I thought it was cool, but I had never been to an event like that live. And this very first event, this was a client of mine that I was working with just on business consulting. And he got the first license to TEDx San Diego. So I went to his first event, and it was actually held inside of a jazz club. So it was a place that I already knew. Very cool. The place was packed with hundreds of people, and I didn't know what to expect. And when the individuals got up on stage and started telling their story, it's a completely different energetic experience than sitting in front of a computer and watching a video. You hear people laughing and applauding. The vibe of all those people in the room was very different. And so it really got me excited for what this kind of format could be, where people get up on a stage and tell a story to an audience. it sort of broke the mold of, if you want to tell a story in the old days, you had to be interviewed on television, which means you had to be very famous, or, 100 people wanted to be on TV, but only 2 people got to be on TV. Now with this TEDx format, thousands of people around the world were getting up on stage speaking. So I thought, this is really cool.
Great. And in your personal history, why does it make sense that you ended up helping others tell stories from their firsthand experience?
So I've always loved storytelling from the time I was very young. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I loved electronics, and my parents bought me this old radio. I mean, it was a new radio, but when I say old, it was the size of a toaster. That's how big the radios were back then. And at night, I would listen to these old-time radio dramas, like The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I became fascinated with how the human voice could paint a picture inside your own mind. Yes, I had watched TV and watched movies and got some of that, but there's something about just the pure voice, which is incredible. And then throughout business, my entire business career, I was lucky enough to have a mentor who explained business from the standpoint of being a story. Every product we built had a story behind it. Every customer who used that product, there was a story. Every employee. So everything always related to story. And then when I started consulting and one of my clients started TEDx and I got to see people up on stage, I thought, this is a really unique format. And a couple of years into his tenure, he invited me to co-organize one of his events. And when that event concluded, he gave me the license to TEDx San Diego. So from that point forward, I really had no choice but to begin working directly with speakers, and not just working with them, but also selecting the speakers to create a program that would have a variety of voices, a variety of topics, gender, ethnicity, looking at all the different ways that we could bring diversity to the stage. And I found that it was a passion of mine.
Fantastic. Among the 1,500 plus TEDx talks, like people you've heard tell stories on stage, what are things you have seen or heard that don't work? What are moments when you were like, okay, this is not working for me or for anybody? What are things that people can avoid doing?
Probably comes down to 2 main categories that I've seen occur most often. And one is when somebody's telling the story that from a place that's egocentric, where it's, look at me, aren't I cool, didn't I do something great, rather than being focused on the audience. If you're telling a story, there's something you learned, there's some wisdom that you collected. That the part for me about personal storytelling is that you have this opportunity to give that wisdom to the people in the audience. So when you're really focused on who these people are and how you can help them, the nature of the talk becomes very different. And if it's just somebody on stage bragging, you can hear that right away. So I always tell people, make sure that you're focusing on adding value to the lives of people in the audience. And the other, especially from a TEDx standpoint, is preparation. Because you could speak for hours on a lot of different topics, but somebody is giving you 10, 12, 15 minutes to tell a very concise story. And what I do when I'm working with people is to try to boil those hours down to that small amount so that that story takes people on a journey, similar to how a book is written or a movie is produced. There's a lot of available material, but it's the job of those writers to create a very compelling narrative. And so that part of that preparation is really discovering what your story is. I always tell storytellers that the act of writing and presenting a story is an act of looking inside yourself. It's an act of self-discovery. And if you use the story as a way to discover who you are, that story becomes richer and richer.
Great. Okay. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this podcast, because when we met a few months ago in Lisbon, in a storytelling setting, of course, you mentioned that you had co-organized a TEDx event in a prison, and I was really intrigued by what that could look like. And I would like you to tell us about that wherever you'd like to start.
Well, I would start by saying that I never had any intention of doing a TEDx inside prison. But a woman who was working for one of my partner companies, her calling in life had taken her to become a volunteer inside prison. So she was already working with inmates on other different topics. And it came about that a group of prisoners were writing a play. And they were the play that they would write would be performed on the outside by other actors. And I saw this post on Facebook, and I just made a comment, and I said, if these gentlemen can write a play, do you think they can write a TED Talk? And she said, we have to meet immediately. So we sat down, had a coffee, and talked about it. Up until that point, maybe a dozen TEDx's had ever occurred inside prison. There were very few and far between. So we went to the prison. We talked to the public relations manager. He took it to the warden. We got approval to do this. And we had to really make it up on the fly. We had not been in that kind of environment, but every single week, every Tuesday, we would go into prison. We created a committee of inmates to run the show. I brought my team from TEDx San Diego to do all of the logistics pieces. And then we had inmates apply to speak. And they had to give us a 3-minute version of their talk. And then the committee voted on who the best ones were. And then we started coaching those speakers. So it was myself, and I brought in 2 other gentlemen to come in every Tuesday and sit down with them and help them write out their personal story, put it together. And so on the day of the event, there were 5 inmates speaking and 5 people from the outside world that we brought in to speak. And the audience was composed of 100 inmates and 100 people from the outside. And they all sat together. They had lunch together. It would take a while to explain the entire day and how it all worked, but I'll just leave it there to say that it was one of the most impactful experiences of my life. It was without question the finest experience of storytelling, because it took me into a place that I never thought I would be.
Was there something that was tricky anywhere in the process of organizing that event?
It was just mainly the fact that it was a controlled environment. So we had to go through security every time we went to prison. And you have to fill out forms, and you have to be approved to even be able to go inside prison. You have to be part of this program. There's chain link fences, there's barbed wire, there's concrete, there's guards everywhere with guns. We could only use this one room. So everything was controlled. And on the day of the event itself, it was interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, but we had to inventory all of our equipment. Every camera, every cable, all the way down to every memory module, every nut and screw had to be inventoried before it went into prison. And then we had to do a complete inventory twice a day during the setup and the execution of the event, because they had to be sure that none of the things we brought in were stolen by anybody. So it was a very strange way to live. We don't think about that on the outside. We just do what we want. We have our own schedule. We can reschedule things. We're very flexible. There you have very specific times that you're allowed to do stuff. So we had to be committed to making it work.
And then after the event, were you able to follow up with the inmates that had told a story on the effect that it had on them?
Well, what was interesting is that we actually got to do 2 events in this prison. So we started going in almost a year ahead of time to build up the organization, to coach, and put on the event, which it was interesting because a lot of these inmates had never been to a speaking event. They had never been inside of a auditorium to see this kind of thing. A lot of them went to prison when they were 18 years old. And so they didn't understand what it was we were going to do. And on a couple of days before the event, these trucks would show up and all this equipment would come out. And we built a stage and we brought in all of these chairs. We had the event. And so after the event was done, we kept going in every single week. So we got to hear from them what this event felt like. Not just the 5 speakers who were on stage, but we had a committee of probably 30 inmates and then the 100 inmates who were allowed to attend this. It was life-changing for them. Because as probably the most impactful comment I heard was one inmate saying, "This is the first time in my life somebody wanted to hear my story." They grew up in an abusive household where their parents didn't care about them. School didn't work for them. That meant that they got into a gang. Now, the gang was obviously wanted them to be a gang member, but their story didn't matter. It was the story of the gang. So it was a unique experience for them to be able to tell something from their own heart rather than try to conform to other people's ideas of what their story should be.
Among all the stories told by those inmates, what was it in them that allowed the audience to relate to them and made them think, oh my goodness, I actually have so much in common with that person?
The one word that comes to mind quickly is the word transformation. That throughout their early years, they were being transformed into a person who could commit a crime. And then once they got into prison, they started transforming themselves into somebody who no longer wanted to commit any kind of criminal act. And one individual's story was about how he felt like he was a caterpillar. And a caterpillar voraciously eats leaves all the time. It's just constantly munching, munching, munching. And that's the way he approached life. He just had to gobble stuff up. And in his case, that was criminal nature. But once he got into prison, he had this awakening of he could be somebody different. So like the caterpillar spins a cocoon and out comes this butterfly, he felt that he had become a butterfly in prison. And it was very interesting because this is a gentleman who has a life sentence in prison. And he knows that he will most likely pass away while he's incarcerated. And yet he had this smile on his face. He almost looked like a Buddha. And he had come to this place of calm and compassion and love for other people. And when somebody in the audience who has never been inside prison before hears that story of transformation, they know that whatever is going wrong in their life, that there is this pathway for them to become a different person, to have a different job, to have a different relationship, to mend fences, to look at life differently, to have a very different perspective on the world around them and how they fit into that world. And so we got a lot of feedback from the people on the outside who had come into that event, saying that they were forever changed, that they would look at their own life differently, having seen what these men endured and how they transformed.
Thanks for that. Are there other unlikely environments where you organized TEDx talks?
The other event that was very different, but equally unusual, is we partnered with the team at TEDx Tijuana. And Tijuana is the city in Mexico directly across the border from San Diego. And what we did is we built 2 stages, one stage in the United States and one stage in Mexico. And they were both built right up against the border fence. And you could see through the fence, so you could see the speakers on either side. And we alternated our speakers from one country to the other, back and forth. And in fact, our first two speakers of the day got on stage, told half of their story in one language, and then they drove their car across the border. And at the end of the day, they got back on stage and completed their story in the other language. It took 2.5 years of planning to pull off that event because we had to have approvals from so many agencies and individuals. But the focus of it was to say that no matter how you try to separate people physically with a fence or culturally or through laws or any kind of mechanism that you try to separate people, it's human nature that we want to interact and we want to share who we are. And so you could see art and architecture and food culture and education systems that were happening on both sides of the border. And that it was almost as though people's lives went right through that border. No matter how many walls you try to put up, people would still want to connect with each other. And so it was an amazing opportunity for people to hear stories about what it's like to live on a border.
What was the political context? When did that event happen exactly?
Oh, what was that? 2015, I believe. So the context was before the current environment that exists in the United States. But the border has always been very contentious. It's been an issue in the United States for a very long time.
Right.
What was interesting historically, and this event was called TEDx Monumento 258, because there's an obelisk, a monument right on the border, which separates the United States from Mexico. That this goes back to, 1847, I believe, when they had the Mexican-American War. And America basically captured a huge part of Mexico and took it for themselves. And they had surveyors come and map out what the border was going to be. So they would put these monuments where the border was. So in some of the photos that are on the website, you can see this monument. And they built a stage right around the monument for the Mexican speakers to be speaking on. Because for whatever reason, the monument is in Mexico. It's not in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And so currently, are you working on TEDx events still?
No, we did our last event in 2019, and that was a youth event. So all of the speakers and all of the performers and even the MCs were all high school students. And we actually did a similar thing that we did inside prison, which is that we had students submit video applications for speaking. And we chose all of the speakers, and we partnered with the San Diego Unified School District so we could tap into all of the schools in their district. And my only rule was no adults on stage. So everyone there was 15, 16, 17 years old. And it was brilliant because they all felt like, we've never been on stage. We've never told stories before. How are we going to do this? And I would remind them, you've been telling stories your whole life. This is just one that you're going to be very focused on. So that was a beautiful event. And from that point forward, I have attended other events, TEDx Lisbon and TEDx Porto, but I currently have no plans to organize another TEDx event. I think after 6 years and 20 events, I feel like that chapter is behind me.
Interesting. Great. So what chapter are you in currently, and what are you looking forward to in 2023?
Well, when I left the United States, what I basically took with me, other than a couple suitcases, was just my practice of working with speakers to tell stories. And so that's what I do now. And to me, there's no greater reward, as you well know, when you get to work with somebody and help them craft a beautiful story out of their experience. Sometimes I work with individuals who are involved with nonprofits, so they have a very different kind of focus. I did a recent project with scientists from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So teaching scientists how to take very technical data and turn that into a human story. So that's what drives me today, is just being able to work with a variety of folks to help them tell stories.
So let's talk about advice that you would have for our listeners who maybe don't know where to start, where to tell a story, how, like what kind of story they can tell. How do you know that a story is going to be interesting to an audience?
That is a very common question. In fact, some people come to me and they say, I don't have a story to tell. And I said, that's fascinating. You're the first person I've ever met that has never learned anything in their life, that has never had any kind of hardship in their life, that has never had any success in their life. So I do this jokingly, of course. But it's to say that all of us as humans have experienced aspects of our life that taught us lessons, things that we came away from realizing that we could become a different person by learning. We learn our whole life, and we learn through stories. We learn by hearing the stories from other people. Whenever somebody mentors you, or whenever you hear stories inside your relationship, inside your business, you're constantly learning from other people's experiences. So I ask people, what experiences have occurred in your life that you think other people could learn from? What pearls of wisdom? And sometimes stories are just funny. But what you're doing with a funny story is giving people that joy of understanding how crazy life can be sometimes. But oftentimes stories are about something very traumatic that people went through and that they came out the other side. And in those cases, you have to realize that people in an audience have all gone through some sort of trauma themselves, or they might be in the midst of it right now. And it's always beneficial for us to hear how other people got through that difficult time, because there's that commonality and that connection to say, if they were able to get through this period in their life, I can do the same. So it's what we talked about early on. If you put yourself in the shoes of the audience and say, what story do I have that other people can benefit from? And if you focus on the benefit of the audience, then that helps you get deeper into your own story.
Great. Okay. So we are approaching the last segment of this conversation, which I called Great Things About the Future. So, Mark, if you don't mind, you're going to help me at our very small scale and level change the world. It's the year 2123. Every person who is born on this planet knows from a young age that their emotional truth matters just as much as the next person's, and that they can tell their story live and witness others doing the same. What are some ways that humans have found to make that a reality?
I think what's helped up until this point will continue into the future, which is that this entering the digital age has democratized storytelling. Goes back to that feeling I had seeing that very first TEDx event and seeing people up on stage speaking, where individuals could create an event to host storytellers. And now people are doing that on podcasts all around the world in so many different languages, so that it's relatively straightforward to allow these stories to be told. Whether it's through YouTube videos, whether it's blogging, whether it's live storytelling events, however it's being done, there's more and more stories being told. And the more stories that get told, the more normal that becomes. So that storyteller is no longer thought of as a Hollywood star or somebody famous on TV. We realize that we're all storytellers and that our stories are valid. To your point, all of our stories are as valid as the next person's. You don't have to be famous or be influential or have charisma to be a storyteller. You just have to be you. You have to be authentically you. And I think that authenticity of humanity is what I hope would emerge in this next century.
Okay. You just prompted me one last question. Are you a Web3 kind of guy in terms of thinking of what the metaverse and NFTs, for example, can allow when it comes to the future of storytelling and belonging and such. Do you relate to this kind of thing or not really?
Well, I would just call myself a digital person.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate to have grown up in the computer industry. I was partners in a company that built high-performance computers from the very, very early days, from the very birth of the personal computer. So this was even before there was any internet. There were no websites when we started selling these computers. They were for industrial high-tech applications. So I've seen this evolution. And I remember going to a conference when Larry Ellison, who was the CEO of Oracle at the time, a big database company, and he's giving a keynote speech and he stops and he says, "The internet changes everything." And that phrase, this is 20, 25 years ago. So a long time ago. And that phrase has stuck with me the whole time. So even though people come up with all these new buzzwords and meta this and NFT that, to me, all of that's meaningless. It's really just the constant evolution of digital technology. Just like we're doing podcasts, just like people discovered Zoom over the pandemic. So that will continue. And it will become easier and easier for people to touch other lives in different parts of the world. So whether that's through virtual reality or through any other kind of mechanism that's going to come about digitally and electronically. And that's what I think is the one thing that has that option to really improve humanity is connectivity to each other. Because once you connect to each other through your stories, you don't see somebody as the other. You see somebody as really connected to yourself.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today and for your wisdom that you shared with us. It was a pleasure to get to chat with you. I hope we get to do that again soon. Where can people find you online and learn about your work and get in touch with you?
I spend most of my time on LinkedIn. I don't do a whole lot of other social media stuff. I got into that and got out of that just because it's a time sinkhole. So you can find Mark Lovett on LinkedIn, and Storytelling with Impact is my company. And so anyone's free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And if they want to even set up a call just to have a conversation about storytelling, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brune.
If this podcast means something to you, it would mean so much to me if you'd be willing to take 30 seconds to do each or all of these 3 things. First, can you please follow or subscribe to Première Personne? While you're there, if you'd be willing to give me a 5-star rating and review and share an episode you loved with a friend, I would be so grateful. Première Personne is produced by me, Brune Smith, and you can email me through the contact form at experiencenarrative.com. Thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.